Hi, everybody. It's really a big honor to be here, mostly because of the panelists that I get to sit next to. I can't say that I know my Brazilian colleagues as intimately as my US counterparts. I'm very, very familiar with my US counterparts' work, in part because I live in Los Angeles. And in Los Angeles, Maria Elena Durazo and Pablo Alvarado are hugely, hugely important in terms of organizing folks that many of us would consider workers at the bottom, for lack of a better term. Let me also say with lots of confidence that my Brazilian co-panelists are also very, very important thinkers and organizers in a country many, many miles away from us. And part of what we're going to do today is to learn from each other in terms of organizing, collaborations, and most importantly, victories, right? Victories that have been fought and have been won at a very local context and driven by workers. And so part of my challenge is to facilitate the conversation between all of us here, but perhaps more importantly, to my left, with colleagues. I will not spend any of your time introducing them other than by name only. They have a nice little one-paragraph bio and picture in your program. Please refer to that. Let me just quickly say a little bit about me. I was born and raised here in Los Angeles. UCLA was my first job, smack dab out of graduate school about 24 years ago. I've been at UCLA almost that long. I study mostly immigrant workers. I've perhaps been best known for my work on day labor. These are men who look for work on street corners, public spaces in front of home improvement stores. I did both an LA and a New York and then a national study on that topic. I'm less interested per se in the workers, but their processes of organizing, how they mediate and negotiate with employers, and most importantly, how they are able to improve their lives. And so I've learned a lot by spending time with them, speaking with them, spending time with Pablo and others. And so I will not try to integrate them into the talk, because I think they're going to come out in the talk if Pablo Alvarado makes it. So let me begin with that first introduction. Pablo Alvarado, who is the director of the National Day Labor Organizing Network. He is on his way. I've sent him a text. I suspect that he's coming from some other event, but I told colleagues that I'm pretty certain he will be here. It's not typical of him to be late, but sometimes these things happen in the big city of angels. To my further left, let me begin with Rony Barbosa, who will be speaking to us in his native tongue, the beautiful Portuguese. We will have some translation, and so bear with us as we go through that. It requires patience and us who speak in English very fast to slow down, so I will make my efforts to do that. To his right is Mercia Silva, who will also be sharing her thoughts about some of the work that she's done. To my immediate left is the great Maria Elena Durazo, who has done so much here in Los Angeles in multiple capacities. Again, I'm not going to say much because you'll find her bio in the program. Let me begin by thanking the ILO, the Department of Labor, Humanity United, and my colleagues here at the Burkle Center at UCLA, and colleagues in the audience from the Labor Center, the law school, and from all across campus. My role is very specific to, again, try to facilitate a conversation, and so I will really, really focus on doing that and not so much talking about what I know, but rather what our experts know and what you all know and how you can engage them. To begin, I want to give a little bit of context, and the context that I want to provide focuses on an urban context. You might think of Los Angeles, you might think of Sao Paulo, you might think of Rio. And I'd like you to think about workers way at the bottom. And some examples in the United States might be domestic workers who are oftentimes invisible because they're inside people's homes, or day laborers who are very visible in their search for work, but then become invisible in most every other capacity. You also have restaurant workers who have been organized in the United States in a really, really unique way via a worker center model. But it turns out that restaurant workers who are in the back of the restaurant differ significantly from restaurant workers who are at the front of the restaurant in terms of wages, promotions, gender discrimination, and a bunch of other issues. What's important to know about the restaurant industry is that it is one of the few industries that grew during the Great Recession. And so it provides lots of opportunities for lots of workers in the United States. It's just that we don't know much about how abusive this industry is up until a few years ago with the work of a very important worker center. Another example might be car wash workers. Very, very important campaigns here in Los Angeles to organize this industry, and it's been done in some cases quite successfully. What I can say about each of these four occupations, besides the fact that they don't pay very well, is that many, many friends and allies, both in organized labor, outside of organized labor, really had doubts about one's ability to organize and to work with these folks. And here I'm trying to write a little bit of a historical context because that's no longer true. Organized labor is very much now a part of discussions and collaborations and efforts to improve workers that I just described, these four categories. But that wasn't always the case. And in many ways, these types of workers partnered with other actors to think of how they might improve their work lives. And again, they shared the characteristics of jobs at the bottom: poor pay, itinerant, employers weren't very stable, and much of this workforce was cash-based. Despite, I think, very, very difficult odds, there are very palatable, very specific examples of victories in both the US context, but also an international context in Brazil. And so part of my privilege in being employed here at UCLA is to think about why we're seeing some of these victories. And so I've thought about that sometime, and part of what I think is going on in California is related to actually a conference that took place here at UCLA about 2 years ago, talking about super diversity, right? It's a term to make reference to the fact that this state has reached levels of diversity that are perhaps unprecedented in our history. I'm not sure about that, but perhaps relative to other states in the United States. The fact is that we have lots of diversity going on, and I think the key thing here is that it's been going on for a long time. As I mentioned, I've been here at UCLA for about 22 years. Prior to that, I was a graduate student, and then prior to that, I was an undergraduate student at the University of California, Berkeley. I graduated with maybe 300 other students that looked like me. That was a long time ago. We have lots of state universities, we have lots of UCs, we have lots of private schools, we have lots of Asians, we have lots of African Americans, we have lots of white students, we have lots of folks who have been going through this process of what it might mean to be super diverse in California. That, I think, has been super important in terms of driving some of the unique collaborations that we see emerging in Los Angeles related to what I think is one factor that might explain some of these victories. It's these really interesting collaborations odd bedfellows, if you even want to call it that way. But we're seeing a lot of that, and you can really simplify it and say, well, you know, young college students look at race much differently than my generation looked at race. Or you can jump into the debate that many ethnic groups did in college, right, where we were really struggling with who we would work with to improve the university. And so you had a debate about just working with folks that looked like you or bridging building with other folks that didn't look like you. A lot of those sorts of discussions don't exist the way they existed in my era, and you're seeing lots of, again, strange bedfellows that have resulted in really, really important victories, right? You're seeing the children of immigrants who are being educated. You're seeing organizing undertaken via cultural nuances that are super important. The role of women has been extremely important, for example, in organizing day laborers, right? These are men who look for work. About 95% of them are men, yet most of the organizers at the worker centers and across the country are women. Immigrant solidarity, that takes on a different meaning in places like Los Angeles or New York relative to points in between the country. All of this, I think, has resulted in institutional partners that are varied, they're sophisticated and very strategic. It includes researchers at the university, it includes organized labor, it includes clergy, elected officials and government workers. It includes students who are undergraduates who take courses at the Labor Center, learn a few things about research, become interested in how their research can make a difference, and then go on to grad school, and then earn either a master's or PhD, and don't have any indication or wanting to become a professor, but instead want to utilize that skill in the labor movement. We've been doing this for a long time. And I think that's led to a really robust and a growing environment to organize. And that's, I think, in part resulted in some of these victories. They're creative, they're organic, they're collaborative, they're savvy in lots of different ways, using information technology, providing that information technology to the workers. And it provides, I think, a really nice alternative to view the really important work that we're seeing, not only here in LA, but of course in other parts of the country. So with that, what I'd like to offer my co-panelists is for them to each give us a very short, brief, 5-minute intro on the work that they do. That'll give you a context for their contributions. And then I'd like them to very specifically share one event, one organizing effort that they might make reference to that allows us to learn what's going on in Brazil that might be replicable here in the States, and vice versa. What's going on here in the States that might be replicable in Brazil. Now, that's my directive. These are really smart folks, and they may choose to ignore that. And if they do, I'm not going to embarrass them, and I'm not going to try to bring them back to what it is that they're going to say. I'll, in part, try to navigate that and navigate you all. So, who'd like to go first? Let me be the facilitator and say, and let me select. How about Ronnie? Okay. And then
you want all that in 5 minutes?
Something like that. I mean, let's try.
That's 2 separate 5 minutes, right?
Oh, yeah, yeah.
Right, two
Okay.
separate
Two
5
separate,
minutes, correct.
thank
Or actually 4 separate 5 minutes, right? Because there's 4 of you, or right now there's 3, but I'm thinking Pablo's going to show up and we'll have to give him 5 minutes as well. Ronnie.
Ok. Bem, boa tarde a todos e todas. Eu queria começar agradecendo a organização, especialmente a Nancy, pelo convite. Estamos muito honrados por poder estar aqui conversando sobre temas tão importantes para os trabalhadores brasileiros e norte-americanos. Eu faço parte de um instituto chamado Instituto Observatório Social, que é um instituto de pesquisas que se especializou em pesquisar o trabalho, as relações de trabalho em multinacionais que atuam no Brasil. Temos parcerias internacionais, temos parcerias com a FNC Solidarity Center
in the United States, and the whole world. We have partnership for this research. There were over 200 multinational research by our institute since 1997 when it was created. So it's an example of an organization in partnership with the university sector in Brazil. We have two entities. The Culture Center of Studies in São Paulo, which it's a network of work of professors and teachers, university professors that study the Brazil. They helped found on social work, also acts in a department called GIESE. It's a department of a union which studies the socioeconomic studies for the union movement in Brazil. And the fourth founder institute of our institute was which is the Central Union in Brazil, which is the biggest union, central union of unions in Brazil. It answers for more over 20 million workers in Brazil. It was created in 1983. It has over 3,000 unions which are affiliated. And I'm the executive director also of the central, the union of workers. And I'm a union rep, and I'm a union for the oil workers in Brazil. Our research department do studies in discrimination at workplace and about the environment and collective negotiation, bargaining, security, health, work, child labor, and forced labor. Most recently, all our studies were comparing the conditions of work. And all our studies are based on international norms. Brazil, in the last few years, went through a process of social growth. Unemployment went down 13%, 5% last few years, which is thanks to the government of Lula and the President Dilma. Along with some wealth distribution, like Bolsa Familia, which is a welfare system, the organization of the minimum wage in Brazil, which we achieved a real moment about the inflation. We're able to improve the distribution of wealth in Brazil and remove over 30 million Brazilians from the misery, from poverty, which we let's call middle class in Brazil. It's not the same middle class in Brazil, not same standard of living, but compared to the standard of living they used to live before, it's a much better condition. So Brazil lives in this last few years a process of a social growth, which is extremely strong, based on its internal economy. The raise of the minimum wage, coordinated also with the increase of the salaries in the capitals in Brazil, generated like this vicious circle in Brazil the last 12 years, which is very important. However, unfortunately, from June 2013, there were great manifestations realized in Brazil. So came up in Brazil a conservative right wing, which was silent before. Now it's going to the streets and making noise. And this reflected the election of the National Congress last year. This election, the most conservative congressmen are elected. And since in Brazil we have a presidentialism, which there's a government coalition in which the elected president, as the Dilma who is elected, needs the majority of the Congress and the political parties. Building this majority in the Congress being very difficult to be built in this mandate of her second term. And this is being reflected in several points. Going back as far as voting in the National Congress, one of them is as far as the outsourcing. In Brazil, we have about 45 million workers which are organized with their rights recognized. And there's 45 million 12 million of them are outsourced. And the outsourcing in Brazil became the meaning of a lowering standard of the workers. The outsourced workers have difficulty in having vacation. In Brazil, it's 30 days per year. They have difficulty in receiving the 13th salary, which is, according to the legislation in Brazil, they have difficulty sometimes in getting their pension fund, which is a fund that each month they deposit 8% of the salary. They deposit this when they leave the job. It's a measure so they have a resource to survive when he's unemployed. So all these rights are threatened in the outsourced works, and many times you're not being obliged again. So we have a 4330. It's a project of it's a bill we have in Congress. It's a bill that has the intention of extending the possibility of outsourcing of any activity of any companies in Brazil. Today, only the middle activities, meaning the retention of security, those kind of works, those kind of activities, they're not part of the. So those can be outsourced. If this law is approved in Brazil, including the activity of what the company does, it can be outsourced, which for us is going back in the conditions of the workers of Brazil. One of the reasons for the outsourced works to have lower standards in Brazil is because we have difficulties in representation of a union for these workers. The union legislation in Brazil forbids, for instance, that the outsourced worker be represented by its union when you work at a bank. So they don't have a right to the achievements of the collective bargaining from the union, from the bank workers. As I'm saying here about what my tax, my time is running up. There's a grave problem that's been happening. It's in relation also to the slave worker. We'll talk more about it later. Thank you.
What I'd like us to do is shift to Los Angeles or U.S. context with Maria Elena Durazo.
All right. Thank you, Abel. And good to meet my sister and brother from Brazil. It's always great to hear about the news in Brazil. So important and so powerful. As Unite here, I know you've got your little blurb in there, but just two things in terms of our work here in Los Angeles. I started out with the hotel and restaurant food service workers in Los Angeles, leading my local, then went to the Federation of Unions of Los Angeles, the second largest federation of unions in the country. And that was an enormous experience to get an understanding of what takes place across the board, whether you're a teacher or a firefighter or a hotel worker, what are the combined issues of labor and what we face. I just came back to Unite here at the national level on civil rights, immigration, and diversity. And I think our industry of hospitality is a good place to talk about those issues because it is an industry made up of women, African Americans, and immigrants. And that is the workforce of the hospitality industry in this country. We, of course, are concerned about the exploitation of workers anywhere, whether it's here in the US or in another country. We have Father Cleek Kiley is our National Director on Immigration Affairs, and he has been very actively involved in a working group within the AFL-CIO, which is the Federation of All Unions, it's the International Labor Recruiting Working Group. And he knows the issues as far as visas for foreign workers in detail far more than I do. But I think the gist of it is we have had experience in the hospitality industry of employers bringing in foreign workers, specifically around the times of organizing campaigns, or where an employer thinks that there's an organizing campaign and wants to protect themselves from union organizing by bringing in other workers. So we've pushed, and we've been part of this group to push really hard in areas like that have to do with recruiters, labor recruiters. We've also participated in delegations to Mexico, to the Congress, and to the Central American Parliament. And one of the ideas was that we join on comprehensive immigration reform in this country, that we act more as partners and find our common issues, but also to address the work, the issues created by international labor recruiters. And so in that experience, of course, we find that we've got to be in partnership with churches and faith communities, immigrant communities, and many other, all these networks, so that we could have the power to raise our issues in Congress. I want to say that as an organizer here, I read this report, I think it was in one of the materials, about 21 million victims of forced labor and $150 billion in illegal profits in the world. That's quite extraordinary. Imagine what $150 billion would do to the economies of many of the countries where there are these victims of just extraordinary exploitation, extraordinary exploitation. And so we see it from labor movement's point of view is not only the working conditions in the countries where these workers are most vulnerable, but also the connection to workers in this country. And I think that we've always have to look for the connections amongst us all and not treat these issues in their silos, separate, because we'll never be able to deal with it. And we know what the experience is in this country when workers have these vulnerabilities. And I'm talking about vulnerabilities where all workers would be hurt. So when men and women and children are forced to accept poverty in their lives here in this country, when they have to work full-time and 2 or 3 jobs, can anybody say they're forced? It's forced labor? Well, maybe there's no gun to their head. Maybe they aren't forced to live in a certain place or confined to a certain place. But I would say that they are forced. They can't put enough food on the table, or they have to live with another family in cramped conditions. They have to do things like sell, fruit on the streets to make a few more dollars, or sell eggs up and down, poor neighborhoods to make a few more dollars. They are forced to work and live in poverty. And many of these workers here in this country are in the formal economy, where they have to live and work in these conditions. Others, many of them, are just one step away from the underground informal economy. One step away. Sometimes one of their jobs is in the informal economy, other job is in the formal economy. Meaning no minimum wage, no workers' comp, no overtime, no health care, no rights, no protections. And sisters and brothers, one group that you can say it covers almost everyone is the 11 million undocumented workers in this country. Okay? These are not, we're not talking about workers in China or Bangladesh or Pakistan or El Salvador or Mexico. Here in this country, in a number of different industries. When I was young, I grew up in a migrant farm worker family. I was alongside my parents, who came from Mexico, and my 8 sisters and brothers. We worked in the fields. As soon as I was able to walk, I was working in the fields, doing whatever needed to be done. Did somebody force us? You call it forced labor? Well, I would say, yeah, we wanted to survive. No one forced my parents and older sisters to leave Mexico, except that my dad did not want to see his family suffer. And so he made the trip here. So 11 million undocumented people, men and women, live with the constant threat of deportation. And we have not had relief or a change in the immigration laws of this country for undocumented immigrants in 30 years. That was the last time there was any positive change in reforming the immigration laws. Their numbers grow every year that we don't have comprehensive immigration reform. Poverty in this country grows. That is why the flip side of comprehensive immigration reform are numerous studies that the moment we give any form of legal protections and work permits to these workers, the economy will boom. It will grow. There will be billions and billions of dollars into the revenue of our government. And entire industries rely on these vulnerable workers. Not a few cases here and there, but it actually is their model. It is their business model to have undocumented workers and to not provide them with the basic minimum labor standards in this country. So I just want to end that this effort of changing the immigration laws is very much connected to what is going on in other countries, the vulnerabilities of workers in other countries. I think that when you have a statistic that there's $26 million a week in wage theft in LA, that is a crisis. That's a crisis. We should never allow that to exist. And I think if you talk about illegal profits, they should include wage theft. You know, illegal profits should include a business that does not pay health care to its workers. Because who pays for it? We do. All of us pay for it, okay? It should be illegal profits for Walmart to accumulate billions of dollars and yet close down. I don't think any of us in our generation ever imagined that one family, the wealth of one family would equal the wealth of 43% of American workers. Now you think about that. Growing up, we always thought that was somewhere else in the world. Like Brazil. Or Mexico. I mean, we always thought that was somewhere else. But today, that is the truth. And Walmart can close down 5 stores and fire hundreds and hundreds of people with a few hours' notice, and there's no consequences. 0 consequences. So sisters and brothers, we are partners, labor's partners. Our union is a partner with all of our allies to change the laws to protect workers, foreign workers who come in. But I think that the best contribution we could make is to raise the standard of living, to make sure more workers are included in our rights here in this country. Here in this country. And so I think that protecting the right of a worker, wherever he or she is, to have a union, to freely choose a union, to freely associate with the union, not through threats, not through intimidation, no firing, no kidnapping. We should have that in this country well established, and we've got a ways to go. So thank you all very much.
Thank you. For those of you who might be keeping time, I have made an executive decision to extend the 5 minutes to about 7.5 minutes, in part because Pablo Alvarado had an emergency and will not be joining the panel. So it's 3, so that gave me a little bit of that liberty. Well, there's 4 of us. I will say one quick thing when, after we hear from Mercia, that Pablo texted me to emphasize about the forced labor, but it won't take more than a minute. Let me continue by asking Mercia Silva to give us about 7.5 minutes of commentary.
Good afternoon. Thank you for being here. Thank you for inviting me. I will speak in Portuguese. I have not enough English to be efficient.
Eu não tenho inglês suficiente para ser tão eficiente. Então eu tenho que aprender um pouquinho mais para poder estar confortável para poder falar inglês. Thank you all of you. Nancy, to give me this opportunity. When we hear the other panelists, we change a little bit what we have to say. And the conversation that we have in Washington, D.C., I saw the aspect of the worker that needs to build an identity and the knowledge that they have to connect with one another. And when you talk about the aspect of the diversity and polarized area, and has many differences of remuneration, and the difference between the rich and the poor, the disequality, it's always the not equality that I always think that the other one is inferior or the other one is superior to us. This has access to the culture, options of work, and then understanding that we need what is a decent life, what is a decent work. So it creates illusion. We also have that concentration. I receive a good salary, but I'm between the 10% of, and I cry because of that. I'm far away. I'm far away from getting the loan to get to buy my house, but 7%. That stays only in 1% of the population. That takes us to where, like Ronnie was saying, we have a law that elevates this scenario, and that's in the whole world. You have gaps of work that's fantastic, and bigger and bigger gaps of the concentration of work, and they live in the same place, in the same. And then you create this legislation to be bigger and to create the legal capacity of the companies to creating these bubbles of work, to go to bubbles that are more precarious. And you create these scenarios of not equality, where you create no equality, and you create stigma. You get a person that's going to work in a precarious situation, that can only see themselves in their place, and that take the benefit of this vision of this. If you were a domestic worker, the first thing that my daughter has a work in the daughters of my employer. So that's that it's very, very bad, because we see this whole process going. And so to change this culture and to see that the other one is inferior, it's very, very important. And so I wanted to visit the Posta Forbes, visit the Forbes magazine to create the most poor ones. I think I wanted to go to the rich ones and ask them, aren't you ashamed to make that much money? That question we need to do. When in Norway, I don't know if it's the law that creates the culture that create the law, that nobody makes more than 6 times the salary of the lowest ones. That's a paradise. You create everybody So the work that they do, that makes sense. It's not the remuneration, it's not the salary, it's the wages, the status or the remuneration of so-and-so profession. So happy as happy can be a person being a no-skilled worker or a surgeon in Norway. So we have to think about these gaps and understand the sense of work, and we needed to turn our eyes to this place and to understand, because it varies a lot. And see, in the sense of people, we need to learn to organize what they have in common. I don't want to organize anybody because I think it's not fair. It's a tragedy. We have to find another common aspect instead of the capacity of each worker, that they feel that they are shared between other organizations. I wanted to show some cases where is this that don't look at the work of the other ones with despair. As like, for example, for the domestic workers, the biggest, the leader of it was the biggest against the law. It was the wife of a judge. How can they can be against a benefit to the worker? Somebody that is working in her home, taking care of her kid, that's domestic worker, how can the judge of wife go against the law for this to have the same right like she has? So it's this type of cruelty creates this cauldron. And we accept this soup that's done in this cauldron. I know another news of a North American executive that went to work in Switzerland. The first thing that he wanted was going to work in Nestle with the products American to receive this huge salary. Much more than what Swiss people make there, the workers they make there. I was here in the United States reading about when the government helped those companies in the crisis, and these executives receive as a bonus 50% of the salary. What? What is this? That's a scandalous that the executives take 50% of this money. So this money goes from richer to richer, and the inspector of these farms in Brazil was here one time inspecting a farm, and he was reading of the process. 37 people went there to the process, talking about the workers, talking about, and the manager of the farm called, and the owner, this here, we have to pay a fine, we have to pay the rights for everyone. What do we do? Oh, wait a second, I'm arriving there, said the owner. Oh, wait, because the owner of the farm is coming. Okay, the investigator waited. And the owner of the farm arrived with big luggages with cash to pay the money to the workers in cash. No, it can't be. It is unbelievable. The inspector having the money, but now that he had the compulsory to pay, he brought cash to pay for the workers, and it's a despair. So the concentration of money still stays with the rich. They are concentrating the same family that makes the concentration globalization of wages. It's very, very important that we are aware and make awareness of this and publicizes this. And when you talk with companies, what are you doing against it to end the slavery work? They list some of actions in the human rights. There are very few lines. report Jones and this and that. Why these reports that it's worth our pressure? And I wanted to see the whole page for questions of development, of lines of work, not only 2 questions. I want the whole report, the whole spectrum for us to follow, because they always have this report, international report that they do on pressure. But the last case that I want to tell, it's to feel the movement. We were at a meeting at Conatry, that we talked this morning, and somebody got up. Oh, see, talking with the chef of the investigation. You guys did X of investigation for the state, in my state, and they only found 1 case. Oh, so that's good. It's working. Yeah, it's working. Yes, it is. That's the good news that I wanted to give to you. The inspectors they have found other problems, but they already the slavery labor has been eradicated. We gotta continue with our eyes open, and we wanted to work more and more. I would like, in terms of the ratio issue, that we have to work in that. We will have to work on that too.
As I mentioned, Pablo is unable to join us, unfortunately. If he were here, I suppose he would emphasize a few key things that's germane to our discussion. The first is that the NDLAN, the National Day Labor Organizing Network, has spent considerable resources and time organizing around comprehensive immigration reform, and also with the DREAM movement, young people becoming or participating in this process in favor of a process of normalization. And I know he would probably emphasize this because in our conference call in preparation for today's panel, he said, look, I'm going to talk about comprehensive immigration reform as one of the most important pillars of what we do. This wasn't always what they did. They really spent a lot of time, if you will, putting out fires, that is, organizing the day-to-day of the workers that they were advocating on their behalf. They've grown, and they have, in some ways, shifted some of the priorities on comprehensive immigration reform for some of the reasons that Maria Elena Durazo mentioned. And that's because one's status is significantly important in terms of determining one's outcomes in many of these low-income jobs. And let me just give you 2 other examples. So wage theft is another area that NDLAN spends a lot of time, and they do that for 2 primary reasons. One is because it occurs a whole lot, and 2, because it's one way to intervene and provide some form of direct measure, relief, if you will, when they're able to win wage theft cases. And the ways that they deal with wage theft ranges from shaming unscrupulous employers to having relationships with the LAPD that then allows them to go to unscrupulous employers' home, to working with elected officials and others to develop legislation to support an easier process to file claims for workers who aren't provided their daily wages. Now, when I say daily, it should be underlined heavily because that's one direct way that day laborers become forced laborers. That is, they'll develop a relationship with an employer, and the employer will promise to pay them the next day. They'll come back the next day, go to work, and then they'll promise to be paid the next day. And that accumulates. And it accumulates because workers have already invested their time and effort. And so not coming back means that they'll lose that earnings, but also knowing that if they don't work, that could also lose that earnings. And so in many ways, it becomes self-revolving, and these men, and to a small extent women, then fall into this process where they're beholden to unscrupulous employers. The last thing that he would mention, I think, in support of what Mercia articulated, is that they spend significant amount of time developing workers, their capacity, their level of consciousness, their positionality, breaking down our system of capitalism, understanding hierarchies, understanding power. These are well-known strategies that many traditional unions do. I think I'll be very careful about saying if they do that a whole lot, because I can't say I'm a historian of unions, but I do know that for worker centers, spending time with workers, talking about their own consciousness and where they are and where they might be in the future is extremely significant to get worker buy-in, to get them to participate in other collaborative efforts, to get them talking about unions, to get them talking about clergy, students, researchers, and other collaborations, but more importantly, their own positionality in this broader system of inequality. Super important, and so they would spend a lot of time and effort there. So those are three, I think, really solid examples. They, I think, also represent key inflection points to think about where you might intervene to develop some of this. So I'll now ask my colleagues to perhaps give a similar example or two that might get us conversing about how we might think of more organic, worker-driven actions to improve working conditions in our respective places of organizing. And I think it's fine if you think like Roni wants to bring out the broader, bigger state apparatus and politics, or if we want to go down to the very local level like Mercia in terms of worker capacity and development, or maybe a mix of both, which is a little bit of Maria Elena did, if I'm summarizing some of their comments accurately. So maybe we should start in the same order with Roni, and then Mercia, and then Maria Elena, and then I'd like to open it up to the audience. And so my idea here is a couple of minutes, and then we open it up.
About outsourcing, we know that he has the slave work in Brazil, because in Brazil, the slavery work has been growing in the urban areas and has gone over the number of cases of the rural areas and the urban areas. We see the industries of textile industry, construction industry, which are linked to this type of the slave work. And when you verify which kind of companies are linked to this, we realize on the most part, a company that are outsourced by other bigger ones. The slave work doesn't happen in the bigger companies. It happens in the companies that outsourcing companies that are hidden. So the moment of outsourcing puts in risk the possible increase in conditions of the slave work in Brazil. That's a fact, some fact that needs to talk about. But I need to talk about radicalization of the slave work in Brazil. Well, Mercia commented here about the success of slave work in Brazil. Success is determinative, as my point of view. It started a recognition of the Brazilian government of the existence of the problem in Brazil. Once Brazil recognized that there was slavery work, there was fundamental so that there was an organization, they organized itself against it. There was a dirty list that listed all the companies that were caught with slavery work, and the next step is what to do with this list. It's to publish it. How to utilize this list. And then there was a pact that came up, which was organized by the international ILO, Report to Brazil by Sakamoto, our friend Caio, and by the Institute of Services. These four entities were organized the pact in a way never seen before in Brazil, like the Social Observatory, and the businessmen too, the Institute EPS, they're united in the combat to the slavery work. Through this pact, companies adhere voluntarily. Okay, there's some of them not so voluntary like that, but the principle is voluntarily they join it, and they come with the commitments of the combat to the slavery work. And the main commitment is not to do business with companies with the dirty list of the Ministry of Work in Brazil. So that is the main reason for the organization of the pact. Beyond that, the companies also can commit to do a monitoring, to answer an annual questionnaire of how they're doing the slavery work in Brazil. How do you do this in your network of suppliers? So what they do annually, they fill out a questionnaire, which is a monitoring, so this to see how these subjects, how these problems happen. For some years, they have representation of over 20% of the national income, over 30% of the GDP. They allow that these entities remain in the same way, give attention to this process. So in 2014, they created an institute called Impacto. There was a new way of organization of the company, contribute annually and financially to sustain this process or to organize combat against slave work in Brazil. To me, this is a great experience and great result, a successful result that I want to share with you, that we are very proud of because it's working out well, and we hope we can stay on this path.
Thank you.
Obrigado.
So we'll go with the order. So Maria Elena,
A ordem da Maria Helena.
so that we go consistent with the order. Is that
Okay.
Yep.
I really agree with my brother here about when there's a recognition of a problem, you can do a whole lot more. When there's a denial of the problem, we're really, really straight up the hill. And just use the example of minimum wage. We have been finally, on the national level, there are some political leaders and some business leaders who are beginning to acknowledge that we have a wage inequality problem. Some are now saying, let's raise the minimum wage. But it's taken us several decades to get here. And I say that because we started with the campaigns for living wages in Los Angeles, and then it grew and grew and grew to many cities across the country. But we've been doing living wages, ordinances, laws on the local level for 20 years. And now there is some recognition, so we can begin to push that a little bit more to the point where, and we keep pushing the envelope in Los Angeles. We're going to get to $15 an hour as our minimum wage over the next few years, but we're going to get there. We've got to always push the envelope, push hard. I want to give a specific example of a campaign where the vulnerability of immigration status was a big issue. We had an organizing campaign at Pomona College that the food service workers started. And they, of course, had great support by the students, and it was really going well. They had tremendous support amongst the food service workers. One day, out of nowhere, the administration decided it wanted to audit the immigration status of those workers. Okay, so they're doing things by the way it should be done. If enough workers say we want better working conditions, they exercise their rights in this country, what happens? The employer says, oh, all of a sudden, we're really concerned about what your immigration status is. And we don't want to be held liable. Mind you, this was not ICE coming in and saying, you know, we're checking documents. This is the employer on his own. And so a number of people were told they couldn't work anymore, including a number of leaders. It had no doubt that it had some impact, a chilling effect on the rest of the workers, but they kept on moving forward. At that time, President Obama, through a lot of push by our dreamers, announced the DACA, the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals. And although many people think this is for college-only students, it really was for young people. You know, if you arrived in this country undocumented as a minor, you had a right to get this permit. And so some of the leaders did. They were young enough. They went through the process, and they applied, and they got the DACA, and they got the work permit because of that one decision by the president. Those workers went back and said, okay, here you go. Here's my work permit. They were taken back, and they successfully completed the campaign. Those workers won union recognition. Then they went on to negotiate a first contract. And of course, the working conditions, the wages, the benefits, all got significantly better. That is an example of the connection between being an immigrant worker, a foreign worker in this country, and the union movement, standing with them and saying, it is not our concern what your immigration status is. Our concern is a standard of living for any worker in this system, no matter who or where you were born or what your language is. We stand for all workers.
Just really briefly, I just finished a research project, and we have a section that documents post-DACA impacts, economics, and in a local context, all very positive. All of the studies that have been done all show positive outcomes, impacts. So you're right. Comprehensive immigration reform or any sort of movement that goes towards normalizing one's vulnerable immigration status leads to almost instantaneous results. I want to be a little bit cautious about that, but clearly it leads to outcomes that are significantly robust and different than previous life. And here I'm talking about earnings and job opportunities, huge difference. Merci.
Ok. Voltando ao português. Primeiro, eu queria dizer que trabalhei no Observatório Social durante 10 anos.
Worked in a social
Eu entrei
department
para fazer
3 years,
transição
and I
do projeto
created methods to make a transition from the
PAC
process of PAC to impact as a social coordinator of impact,
para poder brincar pouco com todas as coisas
and
que
trying to
envolvem
play with a little bit with all the things that involve the articulation of several groups inside of an institution, like an impact, to try to solve subjects like there's the forced labor, and we'll be able to bring you a few examples. Like CONTAG is National Confederation of the Workers of Agriculture, which links to CUT, which is the central of the Brazilian workers. The union reps in Brazil are facing a lot of demands and challenges. After all, the whole process since democratization is also in the hands of the workers. The organized workers were able to help the country get transition from a dictatorship to a democracy. And one day we get to the consolidation, and so goes on. They were facing many things, and now they were able to widen the horizon to think of these workers who are vulnerable. So it's a very good initiative that is happening as the organization of workers of agriculture. They started to do. Now I'm mixing with English. To improve the knowledge, and from the point of view of those workers who are not part of the union, who are in a situation of being vulnerable, they are at the door of becoming victims of a process of seducing product to work in the type of work they need is always slave work. So we need to help these workers. It's a very interesting initiative to bring this responsible to work. And the objective is not to make it become unionist. It's maybe to become to have knowledge of their rights. So it's a very good initiative. On the other hand, there's an initiative that was partially financed by the Rockefeller Foundation from the United States, which is the following. In the textile sector, in the urban area of São Paulo, almost 19 people, inhabitants, to have the biggest industry of textile industry. And there's an area occupied by a lot of Bolivians. They come from Bolivia, some with undocumented, some with documents, some undocumented, so they work for this company. So after the industrialization, this space that was only being highlighted by other objectives, an organization, an alliance that created a project that intended to help the factories that do like the sewing and working with the management. They didn't know how to put even the prices each piece of clothing. They didn't know if they would cost 1 real or 20 reals. They had no understanding how to do the management part, to put the prices, the cost, the cost benefit, and separated the personal expense of the company. So the alliance with the entrepreneur, it said if you improve this management part of this factory, they'll be able to have a better capacity, a better ability to negotiate through the productive networks until they got to the big chain stores, Carrefour, for instance. These people look back and say, look, they're doing quite well, so they deserve to receive more money because information comes from one side to the other. So developing this technical capacity right there helps, is very helpful. It can solve the problem. So there are two cases of mobilization and an answer to a problem of vulnerability, a different vulnerability. I'm not vulnerable because I don't know. I'm vulnerable because I don't know how to manage it. I'm more vulnerable because I don't know anything about the rights. So it's something very important that we're going to bring and reproduce this method, this pathway, this way of doing inside of Impacto to other sectors. So we have mobilized a few sectors so we can think of the whole network, of productive network, and do a sustainable business of environmental aspects and the work aspects. So it's very important for us to see and give more information for them to improve the decisions in relation to the rights.